Seminar, which is by Lennon from Thinkubator Media. She has a very long experience in media communication and media companies, including, both classical broadcasters and more news of, I guess, what we used to call new media 10 years ago, but which is now thoroughly older. And most of us, even my age, use it. Laurie has a little less time than we usually have, so we will have about an hour for her presentation plus her answering questions and discussion. But she has told me nonetheless that she would like to be interactive, and so she would love to get questions during the talk. I will help monitor the chats, and I think Jake is monitoring the YouTube comms channel. And if you want to kind of open your camera and raise your hand, that's fine too. I'll try to keep an eye on that. So with all that said, I would like to thank Laurie again for joining us here. And Laurie, you have the floor to share your wisdom with us.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate the intro. I'm excited to be here. So thanks for having me. And I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is science communications. So let me start this here. So like Ralph said, my name is Laurie Lennon. I'm the founder and CEO of Thinkubator Media. I come to this company with, I built this company from a very background that was all over the place a little bit, I guess. Like Ralph mentioned, I worked in TV news for a good while, which is why we do a lot of media training for folks to kind of help them navigate that space. I spent some time as the director of communications for the College of Science at Northeastern, which is really where I fell in love with science communications. I'm not a scientist myself. I'm a journalist by training. So this is as close as I get to being a scientist. So I love helping researchers kind of figure out ways to talk about their work to folks who may not necessarily be in their discipline, but could really benefit from learning from the work that they do. So what I plan to do today is kind of talk about how folks can really use some tools and stuff to talk about their work in ways that may be less complicated, but are still very accurate. Jake and I were talking prior to this as well, that I have some resources that I can share after this talk that'll be included in some of the places where you can watch this video afterwards. And also, please interrupt if you have any questions during this chat. It's always really helpful because I consider these talks more ways to get you to start thinking about how you're talking about your work. And there's usually very specific questions that some folks might have that we're not going to bring up. So let's start with the problem, right? So it's not really a problem, but when we start talking with researchers about how they are communicating their science, we always try to think about okay, where are folks getting stuck, right? And what we find as the main issue is that this company or this research is your baby, right? You've been doing this work for decades, so it's easy for you to kind of talk about your work because you eat, sleep, and breathe it. But sometimes where we find researchers are having the problem is stepping back and saying, okay, how can this work be simplified in a way that other folks might understand? And also not get in the weeds about some of the work that you're doing, which is something that's very common with folks who are very passionate about their research, right? You want to talk about it in the ins and outs and kind of get into all the special pieces of it. So, we work with folks on trying to figure out how to pull back and keep the conversation high level. Science is really complex, so sometimes those messages are hard to simplify. And there's a concern with simplification of science and making it sound inaccurate. That's an issue that we deal a lot with scientists. Is that they want to make sure that as they're simplifying their message, they're not watering down the work that they're doing or misrepresenting it. So we'll talk about that as well. One of the big pieces that we work with in messaging is also storytelling. Storytelling is a big part of messaging, but it can be challenging challenging for folks to kind of figure out what that story is or how to start putting it into their messaging work. And then, putting all those things together can also take a little bit of work. So we'll walk through all those pieces during this chat. So why we want to worry about this in the first place, to truly communicate science, we just need to, and for people to get excited about science, we just need to help people understand what it is and what you're doing. And building a strong message and a strong story will help you kind of get your work across to other people, right? So I usually think of it as the game of telephone, right? So if you're creating a message and a story, how are you gonna talk about it in a way that multiple people can talk about it? And by the time you get to say like the fifth person who's sharing the work that you're doing, that it's still accurate, right? That's where the storytelling and messaging comes in. All right. But before we get to actually building a message, there are some key pieces that we need to talk about first. And the reason why these are important, the goals and the audience, is because it's going to help you understand how to talk about your research and who you're going to be talking about it with. And when you understand those pieces, you'll be able to create a message that'll resonate, right? So, if you're talking to the general audience versus, say, folks in your field, that message is going to be different. So when you're thinking about like how you want to spend your time, where you want to be spending your time, that'll help better understand how you should hone your message. All right, so first one is goals, right? So you want to start thinking about the goals of your research and why it matters. And this question can be frustrating for some folks, but we ask it with kindness. But why should people care about what you're doing? Right? It's a fundamental question, and it's going to help you figure out how to gain interest in the work that you're doing. And the reason why we talk about this one a lot is, I've worked with researchers, physicists who've done things like protein replication. And when I talked with this faculty member in particular, the comment they had was, this is so fundamental. The real impact is going to happen 10 years down the road when folks are using this protein replication to do something else. And it was really interesting to me to see that that wasn't identified as a really important fundamental piece of why they should be talking about their work. So getting them to think about why people should care and why it's important and why their work is important is something to start thinking about. And you just want to make sure that when you're thinking about the work that you're doing, a lot of folks have research that can cover a lot of areas. I've worked with a linguist who did some research around innate knowledge, and that can really cover a huge field, right, of possibilities. So just really starting to think about like, what are the real big key ways that your research is making impact? There's probably 5, 6, maybe 10 ways that it can, but let's pick some of the bigger ones that we can start with. And when you're thinking about like sharing your message, it's easier to share 3 things rather than 10. So, just kind of thinking about what are the biggest impacts and how can you start talking about it. So that's what we're going to talk about, goals. And then the audience, right? So who do you want to talk to? Who is the audience that you want to get in front of right now? And obviously this audience and the goals even are going to change over time. But when you're thinking about right now and where you want to get to, who are the folks you want to talk to? So some of the questions that we really want to start asking is, what is your goal? Based on your goal, who's the most relevant audience? Who needs to hear about your work right now? Where are these people? Are they industry specific or are they outside your industry, right? So we work with a lot of faculty who are interested in doing a lot of fundraising. Jake and I were chatting about how grant funding is really frustrating sometimes, and it's a hustle. So, what are the ways, where are these folks, and, who do you want to talk to? So that's kind of how you want to start thinking about your audience and who you want to get in front of. Does this make sense to everyone up to this point, or are there any questions about goals or audience? Okay, we will carry on. Okay, now we get to the fun part, which is my favorite part, is building your message, right? And I've said this before, no one's going to be invested in your research as much as you are, but that makes sense because this is kind of like your life's work, right? So your work is important. You just need to communicate it in a way that makes folks understand how special it is, right? So the message you create has to resonate. So you want to make sure you practice and share your message with folks who aren't familiar with your work. This is my favorite part because one, you're not doing the work alone. But two, you get to kind of bounce these ideas off other folks who can ask the whys and the whats, right? When I was working at Northeastern as the director of communications, that was my primary job, was to figure out with the faculty members, this doesn't make sense. What does this mean? This doesn't make sense. What does this mean? So like having that extra person to just kind of bounce your ideas off of and hone your message can be super, super helpful. And that's where you can also practice and refine, right? So it's just kind of saying, hey, Professor X, this is the way I'm thinking about talking about my work. Does this make sense to you? Where are the holes? And it's also really helpful to practice and refine your message because you really don't want to share, you're the first time that you're sharing what you do in this new way to be in front of folks who you need to be in front of. So you want to make sure that you're taking some time to practice asking for that feedback and then refining from there. And just remember, just like your audience and your goals, this message will change over time depending who you're talking to and what you're looking for. One of the things that we also kind of like to share is that a lot of the companies we work with now are interdisciplinary. And so what we have seen is that depending on the discipline of the person within the company, whatever that discipline is, they always talk about the work differently. So they're talking about it in their research specific way. So having this broader message can be really helpful to kind of bring a team together. Like if you're working with a bunch of folks in your lab, just having a strong message that is more company or research specific rather than discipline specific can be really helpful. So that's another reason why messaging is really important. Giovanna, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I agree with you that at least with staff, some people have some, let's say, difficulties to relate to the public and then, to speak to people who are not very familiar with their job. But what I noted is that at least in astronomy, young generation is much more prepared. They can communicate much better, they like it very much, they are used of it. But I also noted that their way of communication is also very, very short. They know how to communicate it because they are used with YouTubes, but they're used to do it with a few words. Because, with Twitter, you have to write the message very soon with a few words. So what at least with the program that I am involved in now, what we're trying to teach them is to elaborate more. To have the message clear, they can do it, but also to speak more about that and to connect it with the different aspects, because, sometimes they are direct, but then they don't have the overview. Do you see this in your experience as well?
Yeah, sometimes I do, Giovanna. Like there are times where when we're communicating with folks, sometimes there is no opening to ask questions to be afterwards. Be like, so if I ask you, what do you do? Sometimes the question is, I do X, Y, Z, period, right? But what we try to train folks to do is, I do X, Y, and Z because, and then keep going, right? And it's a fine balance too, because you want to make sure that you're engaging with folks, but you're also not taking up all the space. So it is definitely a little bit of balance. So when we are talking with folks, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but like the networking piece is where we see this being the biggest struggle is, how can you talk about your work in a very concise way, but then also build curiosity so you can have that back and forth, right? Because if you're just gonna stop and say like, I do this, a lot of folks are gonna be like, great, it's nice to meet you. But if you start saying, I'm doing this because it has this type of impact, that second piece is what's gonna build that curiosity to start a conversation around what you're doing. And that can be a really nice piece. But I totally agree where, I love this generation that's coming up, and how open they are and how curious they are. But there is that, and I don't think it's only with this younger generation that we're seeing it, as we start consuming a lot of information in multiple different places. You know, sometimes I'm guilty of it. When people call me and don't text me, I think something's seriously wrong, rather than, you know, because I'm not used to getting phone calls as much anymore, right? So it's just kind of like finding that balance, and I think what we usually just say is, how can you keep the conversation going, right? And it's asking questions, it's using statements that build curiosity and don't have like a hard stop at the end. Do you feel that same way, Giovanna, in the work that you're doing?
Yes, I feel the same. And indeed, one issue that we are trying to address is just the networking.
Mhm.
How you deal with that, and how you teach students what to do. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, this is my daughter. You know how it is.
Yes, I get that for sure. Yeah, and you know, Giovanna, we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the
Very good.
presentation, and I'd love to kind of hear what you think about it. And you know, because networking is, and I think
It's key.
post-pandemic, we're seeing it with a lot of people in terms of like going out there and talking to folks and sharing the work. So I'd love to kind of hear your feedback on that
Okay,
when we
thank
get
you.
there.
Looking forward. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for asking that question. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is, so we've kind of got the understanding of why this is important, and the framework to how to build a message. So now we're going to actually work on building this message, right? So let's move on to the next slide here. So to make life easy is, I always say, don't do this alone. And Giovanna, this is a great way to start networking too, and it's a really easy, tangible way to start doing some things like informational interviews for younger folks who are kind of doing a bunch of research and want to get out there, is kind of leaning on collaborators and team and confidants to start building this message, right? So I always encourage folks not to do this work alone. When you start talking about, if you can say like, hey, Professor X, I've built this kind of way that I want to start talking about my work in networking scenarios. How does this sound to you, right? And then that's when you can start listening to the cues, right? Through these conversations, you'll understand where the holes are in terms of talking about what you're doing, right? You want to listen to what whys are they asking, and what are the whats they're asking, right? So it'll help you kind of like make a more solid message that then you can kind of get to the real questions you want folks to ask, right? So you want to make sure that your message is clear and resonates and kind of gets deep enough that folks understand what you're doing to ask really meaningful questions, so that collaboration can be really helpful. Always think why people should care. I really mean that. I don't mean that to sound sarcastic or crap, but like you know why this work is important and other people don't. So you got to get them there with you. So you need to understand why people should care. You should always be asking that question. And having a call to action can be really helpful too, you know, when you're thinking about what that message is. Do you want to identify other collaborators? Are you looking to get out and do fundraising? Are you looking to meet folks who are in the same industry? So like that's really helpful. And then just know that your message will absolutely change over time. As your research changes, as your networking, as your group grows, like all that will impact what you're talking about. Ralph, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I mean, I guess I suppose these different levels are not always there, right? I mean, in the sense that a lot of the work that communication we do is actually outreach, and so then typically, at least the way I look at it, usually you don't want much more out of your audience than that they leave with the feeling that what you're doing is exciting and that somehow astronomy is fun, right? But you don't necessarily specifically want people to do something for you. And of course, in a fundraising setting, it's very different. In the end, you want people to actually say, what can I do?
Right, exactly. But I would argue that when you are in those settings where you're trying to share that astronomy is fun, maybe it's not a direct call to action for them to engage with you more, but maybe there's like other resources you might want to share, or spaces where these folks can learn more, because you want to keep that engagement going too, right? Because I think,
Oh,
and
that's
correct me
true.
if I'm
Yes.
wrong, you,
Yeah.
you don't want the webinar or that session to be the last time that they talk about astronomy, right? So, that, but that's where that audience work helps too, right? So you can say, who am I talking to, and what is the next best step for them?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I see.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see. Oop. All right, so this part is kind of like it's a companion to messaging, if you will, right? Because, as Giovanna had been saying earlier, there's just like a lot out there right now. There's a lot of information to digest and collect, and that leads to shorter conversations. But it also leads to a lot more information ingesting of that folks are doing. So storytelling is a really key piece to kind of help get your message across, right? When we're talking about, like I was referring to earlier, that game of telephone, that's storytelling can be really, really, really powerful. It helps humans really build an attachment to whatever's being spoken about. You'll hear this if you've ever heard a candidate speak in like a forum. They'll always start with the story first, because if you can start building those connections with the audience or people that you're networking with, they'll automatically listen more, right? I was at a networking group session last week, and it was a luncheon, and I got the really terrible spot of speaking when everybody's food was being brought out. And I was thinking at that time, everyone's attention shifted from me talking about what I'm doing to their sandwiches, which makes complete sense, right? But none of these folks knew who I was. But I used that, and a friend had shared this as an example where if we already had that connection together, there would have been the lunch wouldn't have been as big of a deal, right? It would have just happened, but folks would have already been invested in me, and that distraction wouldn't have been as drastic. Like I had to stop talking, everybody had to get their food, and then we could continue on. But if they had my story and they understood who I was and they were invested in the work that I'm doing, that would have been less of a scene. So that's where I use that as like a way that to really show that storytelling can be helpful. I'm a graduate of Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. And when I'm talking with folks, I'll always share that, because the Northeastern network is pretty large. But also, when I've told folks that I don't know that I want to talk to, that I'm from Northeastern too, there's a 90% chance they'll talk to me. Whereas if I didn't put that in there, I would just be some other rando trying to get a meeting with them, right? So that's why I really think storytelling can be a powerful piece to networking and building your message. When I do share this with folks, though, there is always someone or a few folks who will say, my story just like isn't one of those stories, right? I don't have like a pull at your heartstrings rising from adversity story to share with folks, which is what we're all kind of used to hearing. I mean, we all watch reality shows, we get it. But every story is a great story. And the key is not to compare your journey to others. And we'll talk kind of a little bit how you can do that in this slide here. Because just like messaging, you don't have to build your story alone. You can recruit friends and trusted colleagues to help. An example is one of the things that I encourage folks to do is work with someone else on building your story, right? Because much like your research, your story is your own lived experience. So kind of having that outside perspective can be really helpful. And as a journalist, this is something I really love to do. What I encourage folks to do is find somebody to interview them on their story and the work that they're doing. And you'll notice when you start sharing your story, someone will be like, that's interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Or I didn't know you did that. That's really cool. You should talk about that. And even when I'm building things like my own bio, I always recruit someone to help, because your lived experience is your lived experience. You're like, yeah, I did this and it's fine. But like you'll see what folks find really interesting about your story and what you do, and then you can start using that to build the story to kind of align with your message. So always recruit people to help you. It's more fun to not do this alone, and it's definitely more impactful when you have other outside perspectives to kind of steer what you're talking about. And then always test and refine. Just, this is what we do all the time. Test your story on folks, see the whys and whats. What are they asking? What's missing? What's resonating and what's not? And you'll see this with politicians and other public speakers all the time too. That story will change over time based on like the reactions that they're getting from folks in the audience. So that piece can be really helpful. So I always encourage folks to kind of share their story and tie that in with their message. All right, so this is where the messaging can be really helpful. So once you kind of built this message for yourself and your story and your audience and your goals, right, you have the framework to build a research website, create pitch decks to attract investors or donors, use this for networking and elevator pitches. So just when you have that framework in mind, it just starts making life a little bit easier when you want to talk about the work that you're doing. So we work a lot with folks who are doing elevator pitches, and there's a lot of ways that this messaging can help. So you want to make sure when you're going into a networking session, you want to make sure you know your audience and the expectations of the audience. Like, Ralph, like you're saying, is it a group of people that you're just trying to build awareness around? Is it colleagues who could be part of a research project with you? Or is it somebody that, can possibly be a donor for the work that you're doing? So knowing that audience and expectations can help you shape your message, right? You want to build an understanding of your work and then create curiosity and interest, right? So you want to make sure that you're giving enough information to create general interest, build an understanding of what you're doing, and always lead to follow-up questions, right? You don't want things to just like fall off once you start sharing what you do and there's no follow-up questions that are being asked, right? You want to make sure you're building curiosity and an understanding of what you're doing. And you also want to make sure when you're going into these sessions is that you kind of know what your ask is going to be, right? Is it that you just want to share some more resources about astronomy and where people can find it? Is it, are you looking for more research collaborators, or are you looking for funding to secure X, Y, and Z? So like having that framework in mind can really make networking sessions and elevator pitches more meaty, and can help folks really understand what you're looking for, right? Let's see. Okay. And then also with messaging, what you can do is it can help kind of create the arcs of your communications and media plan. So I think of this as a lot of folks that we work with want to do blogs. And usually what we'll get is a message on Monday saying, I need to make a blog this week and I don't know what to talk about. Because that's what everyone does when they're trying to think about blogs. So what we try to do is when you have a message in place, you think of the message as what people want to know you for, right? This is what you want to be known for. So these can be like the guardrails for how you're going to start creating content. So, if I want to be known for STEM communications, like I'll create like, here are the pieces of STEM communications I want to be known for. And then I instantly have topics for blogs all the time, right? So by creating this message, you'll be able to say, oh, okay, these are the things that I want to share and be known for. So here are the topics that I can talk about. So that can really make your life a lot easier. And then also don't forget to share your message with key stakeholders, your team and collaborators, right? Because you want to make sure that your work is being talked about consistently and in the same way in all different areas, right? Because when it's easier to create your own narrative than it is to start backpedaling and starting to revise what people already know about you. We worked with a company who had a very complex research and it was very difficult to talk about. But one of the folks we were chatting with said, we don't mind not controlling the narrative because what folks are saying about us right now is good. So, which is great. I mean, that's not something to be sad about for sure, but their story was being written for them. And when it comes time to them wanting to launch a new platform or share some new research, they are starting from a very different place than someone who has kind of steered their narrative and helping to talk about how they want people to know what they do and who they are. All right. So there are some other elements. I like to talk about this, especially because some of the folks we share our communications work with are doing a lot of things on their own. So this message can also be used for creating taglines for companies and research labs, logos, which are also really helpful to have. A lot of the clients that we work with, even with research labs, are interested in how to create logos. And there's lots of free ways to do it and in a pinch, right? So services such as Canva or WordSwag offer tools and royalty-free assets to help create clean and easy brand identities for research labs and companies and people. Some folks have done something like even just like finding an interesting font to kind of just take over that like top left portion of a website. That can also be really helpful. And then websites are a really great thing to have, especially if you're networking. We work with folks on creating individual websites for folks who are just looking to kind of get out there and meet new people, or if you're a research lab, right? So when people start sharing, if you start talking about somebody, the first thing you're going to do is go to the website and find them. So you want to make sure you have some sort of online presence if you're capable of doing that to share your work with other people. The sites don't have to be complex. They can be super simple. They can be like a single page with just your bio and information on it. It's whatever you want it to be. And there's some tools that can help you, like templated tools such as Wix or Squarespace, that can create the framework for you where you're just plugging in information rather than starting to build your own site. When I started this company years ago, I needed a website really quick. So I literally bought the URL on GoDaddy, used their website builder, and just created a single page site with my information and the arcs of what my company was doing, just so that when I started networking with folks, they weren't like, this lady isn't even online, who is she? So, just having those resources at your disposal can be really helpful. We also, as Thinkubator Media, have a toolkit that can help identify audiences, your goals, and your message. So like I said earlier, that will be shared after this talk, because I think it could be a really useful tool, just kind of get you start thinking about how you're talking about your work. Lastly, great photos are really, really helpful. There's nothing worse than having like a super grainy photo on some like hero image, say on your website. So there's a lot of free photos and assets that are also available on sites like Unsplash or Pixabay that can be really helpful as you're building your work too. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions about this so far? Great. Also remember, be kind to yourself. Science communications does take practice. Sharing your work effectively beyond your peers is really essential for the general public who should be really invested in science. It just takes some patience and some refining. So definitely test and refine, lean on folks who are trusted colleagues who can help refine your message and your story, and know it grows and changes over time, and that you just need to be patient with yourself. And the one thing we always talk about is do not let the first time you share your message and story be in front of somebody who needs to be invested in you. Share it with other folks first, get really comfortable. Every time someone does something new for the first time, it's going to be a couple takes before you really get there. So make sure you're giving yourself the space and time to do that. All right, and then lastly, here's my email. So if you have any questions now and want to ask, I would love to take them. But if you want to connect offline and ask some questions over email or want to talk about stuff, just feel free to drop me a line and I would be happy to chat. All right, and that is it. I'd love to take questions, comments, concerns, please.
First of all, thank you very much, Lori, for that very clear story.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that you have practice.
Yeah, it's one of my, I built a company around it. I love doing this stuff. So, I love science, and some of the stuff that the folks that we've worked with who do some really far-reaching, very complicated things, like getting them to a space where they can talk about their work to like their family at a dinner table is really exciting because that means more folks are learning about science and how cool it is. So
Yeah, how did you
happy to
so
do it.
specifically, since that was not your own background, how did you so specifically end up specifically in science communications as opposed to general knowledge in all fields?
Yeah, so I was hired by Northeastern's the then dean of the College of Science because I could write headlines. Because I was working on when I started at Channel 4, which is a news station here in Boston. Um, I was hired when the internet was like this new fandangled thing, and everyone's like, let's just put some new people on there because we don't even know what to do with this yet. So I was looking to grow, and then also this Northeastern was looking for somebody to kind of help relay science to folks because, you know, as most universities, fundraising is a big piece of what they do and development. So like figuring out how to talk about work was really important for them. So I was working with 6 departments and 3 programs, and you know, some of my favorite places to work was the physics department because that stuff was so complicated and so complex. And, you know, talking about things like topological insulators was something I never thought I'd be doing. But it was just, I really loved it because it helped me really understand the importance of science and folks understanding it. But also, it felt like a puzzle to me. Like it was really challenging, and I like that challenge and the back and forth. I'm not afraid to ask questions or say I don't understand something because I think it helps push people to get to a different place about how they're talking about their work. So all of that is things that I love. So that's what really really drew me to science and really leading the communications career there.
Yeah, I guess and in that sense, you'd also be the perfect person because had you done the same, maybe in social science or in journalism, you would know too much
Yeah.
to kind of spot that the unclarity, so to say, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I guess that's often the problem I feel that when one of my first levels of practice is, of course, always my colleagues, but that there's a real problem there in the sense that they don't know what most people I want to talk to don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least
Yeah. Do you have some?
have a lot of experience with science communication already.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have someone that you could talk to that isn't in your field that might be helpful?
Yeah, usually my poor family suffers the the test subject, but they at least pretend to be interested, so that's okay.
That's really nice. Yeah, I mean that's a great. I mean, first of all, I'm sure you're very comfortable in front of them, so you know,
Yeah.
and the feedback would probably be really the feedback would be honest, I think,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
that's always a helpful group to do that
Yeah.
stuff with, for sure.
All right. But meanwhile, while the two of us are chatting, who else can I give the floor,
Yeah.
please? Yeah, Vanna?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. It was really very interesting, and you know, it is always useful for us to see other you know, points of view and how people feel about science.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in the Netherlands we're really doing a lot about this. At least in astronomy, we started to think how we can really get engaged with the public and also how we can support our students who will leave astronomy to go into the private sectors, confident to what they learned and how they can communicate. So we started a project with this. It's called Skies. And we are continuing it, and the students are very enthusiastic. It is, you know, it is on to teach them entrepreneurial skills, communication skills, open science, and how they can optimize what they are learning during astronomy once they are going either outside or inside academia, because it is the same. You are comfortable with your own zone, you are comfortable with your own environment. You are a PhD student, for example, at Amsterdam is a great environment. And then even when in academia, you go to another environment, then you have to build again that confidence and to continue, to interact with people, to build the networking that is hard. That is a mission, and we are trying to teach them this. So we are starting collaborating with companies like yours, because of course we people like me, we are very interested in this, but we don't know all the skills. So I am learning myself. It's great, and of course we need the support of professionals like you.
Yeah. Well, if I can help at all, just let me know. I'd love to work with you and these younger folks who are interested in doing
it was
really
just
fun.
a training experiment. The whole community was behind it, and now we have the green light to continue. And the students are very enthusiastic, and it's great that people like Ralph, are inviting you, and they are, they are always behind their students to support their growth. And
that's great.
this is what we do.
Do you find that more students are going into industry or academia?
Oh, that is very high. Oh, sorry, Vanna, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's highly variable. I think the world, averaged over the whole world and all topics, only about 10% of PhDs end up in academia, right? Mm-hmm. But for some specific reasons related to the Dutch astronomy program, it's about a third to half, depending on exactly when you ask, of our PhDs who end up in some kind of research institute or academic environment. So it's a bit more, but still, it is at least half for the majority who do not end up in academia. And of course, in a way, that is the intention of universities, because if we would only train people to be our own successors, we wouldn't be very much use for the rest of society. So a very specific comms problem. I wonder whether you have any advice on that one. That often happens in that context is, if you've been in academia, you've done a PhD, you've been in academia for 10 years. Now you are moving outside academia to a company, and you have to not so much explain in generally understandable terms to them what you have done, but in a very specific way why they should care, namely what are the skills that you have acquired that matter to them. And it turns out that is often also not an easy translation. Right? No. Why should you, data science company, hire an astronomer to do your job?
Yep.
And this is the goal
that's hard.
Yeah, this is the goal we're doing with SKY. So the gap. As Ralph said, that astronomy in the Netherlands is a great program and is very successful. It's about the last data, they say about 40% stay in academia. Wow. But when you start speaking with the new generation, you have the feeling that, now, really the very passionate, the very enthusiastic stays, and even the one who really like astronomy, they are starting to judge a bit more strictly the strange balance that there is between personal life, compromise, and work. Mm-hmm. And then they are realizing that, honestly, there are tons of wonderful jobs outside academia that pay much better. And when you speak with some master students, but also PhD students, they're starting saying, I like astronomy, but I can do research also outside the field. I can have a better balance of my life. I don't have to travel. I don't have to have this insecurity, because, you go from one postdoc, 2-3 years, then you travel again. And I loved it, but not everybody loves it.
Yeah.
So we are starting to see a small trend, because, more and more students are very successful outside academia. And now the voice is starting to spread, because that's
Yeah.
networking. This is the communication.
Mm-hmm.
And what is important is that we have to be aware of this, that now is not an issue at all, but nevertheless, we wanted to create an environment in which we valorized the students. And then we show to them that whatever you do, you are investing on yourself when you are doing a PhD. This is for you, is your personal development. We are behind it. And whatever you decide, you can be successful. So it's up to you. And of course, communicating it in the right way is the key. Networking and communication are the two keys.
100%. Yeah. And I hear what you're saying around, what would a data scientist need with an astronomer, but like that's where I think like this work that you're doing is really helpful, because there is a lot of collaboration there. It's just trying to get an astronomer to talk about their work in a way that's relatable to a data scientist, right? So it's just like that audience work, right? Like, okay, well, understanding what a data scientist would need would be really helpful to kind of sharing, making that connection to be like, well, actually, this is something that I work on, and making it relatable could be really helpful. I mean, I met this guy, I could not believe the connection, but he was an astronomer, and he's starting to figure out different ways of making mammograms more comfortable for women.
Yeah.
And it's because of the work that he did. He was like, it all started with me looking at the stars. And I was like, wow.
It's all images. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Anyway, let me maybe go one more attempt and around to broaden this conversation to more than the three of us. Who has any other topics to raise?
And if you don't want to ask it here, just email me, please. I'll drop it in the chat. I'll drop my email in the chat so everyone has it. Let me see.
All right.
Let me do it. And then also, one of the things that we do a lot with, hold on, I just can't type and talk at the same time. If there's, if you're doing work and you want to kind of share your work more with, say, the media, or doing some more outreach in that way, that's something that we love working on folks with. So if you finding yourself like having an opportunity to talk to an audience or a media outlet that may not necessarily be astronomy related, just let me know. I'm happy to kind of talk through strategies and ways to map out those types of opportunities for you, because just like I like to be prepared all the time. So, you don't want to walk into something and just like hope for the best, right? So, what some of the things that we do with folks is we create roadmaps and plans for these types of opportunities. So even if the conversation doesn't cover anything that we talk about in the prep session, there's like this feeling of being prepared that can be really helpful. Doing things like, what are the questions we don't want to be asked, and being prepared for those can be a little bit more comforting for sure. And I just saw, I am on LinkedIn under Lori Lennon, the company's Thinkubator Media, so you can find me on LinkedIn too.
All right. Great. Well, in that case, I would really like to thank you again for that excellent talk and the fun interaction. And thanks very much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.